Now, this wall is the wall where we deal with slavery. We actually have a bill of sale for a young girl in Wilcox County, Alabama. At 11 years old in 1834, she sold for $600. Slavery was about claiming human beings as property. And when the Civil War begins, there are nearly 4 million Americans of African descent claimed as property, held as slaves. And this letter here is also an interesting letter. It's a gentleman who has purchased this woman, and he later finds out that she is sick, and he wants his money back. Because again, he's returning ultimately what is defective property. Slavery is about claiming human beings as property. And when the Civil War begins, again, it is not legal for men of African descent to join the federal army. Congress had banned the enlistment of men of African descent into the federal army in 1792. So the first employment of African Americans in the Union war effort is as contract laborers. But most of these contract laborers are runaways, and so they're called contrabands. So we have items like a group of Teamsters. These are Teamsters, truck drivers today, wagon train drivers back then. They're in line to get paid. And these all this print comes out of Harper's Weekly, a New York newspaper. And this sketch comes also out of Harper's Weekly, and it's a group of contrabands in a morning muster, so they're headed off to work. And again, the term contraband really means contract labor, or someone who is a runaway, who has sought refuge in Union lines, and the federal government is now paying them to perform services, labor for the Union. So this wall deals with this early part of the war. And so then we come to the Emancipation Proclamation. After General George McClellan lost the Peninsula Campaign in July of 1862, McClellan's army was arguably the best trained and best equipped army in the world. It was certainly the largest army in the Western Hemisphere, and it was defeated by an army led by Robert E. Lee that was less than half the size of McClellan's army. When word got here to Washington that McClellan was in full retreat, suffering a humiliating defeat, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1862, granting President Lincoln the authority to arm men of African descent. On President Lincoln's desk on July 17th, 1862, was that legislation and another piece of legislation called the Second Confiscation Act that gave President Lincoln the authority to declare free persons held as slaves in states in rebellion. That's states in rebellion only. He could do this by proclamation with a 60-day warning or notice to the states in rebellion. President Lincoln signed both those pieces of legislation into law on the 17th of July. He met with his cabinet on the 22nd of July, informed his cabinet members that he was going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation immediately, acting on the authority that Congress had given him. But one of his cabinet members, Secretary of State William Seward, advised the president not to take such an action at that time, considering the recent military reverses and the upcoming congressional elections in the fall. Seward argued that if President Lincoln issued such a proclamation at that time, the voters would view such an action, and remember, most of the voters are predominantly men of European descent, that they would view such action as, quote, the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, the government stretching forth its hands unto Ethiopia instead of Ethiopia stretching forth her hands unto the government, close quote. Secretary Seward went on to advise President Lincoln to wait until he could claim a victory on the battlefield so that he might mask his cry for help. President Lincoln called this advice from Secretary Seward wise advice. A prudent president takes wise advice. So President Lincoln waited to claim his victory on the battlefield, claimed his victory on the bloodiest day in American history, September 17th, 1862. It's called the Battle of Antietam. Of the 22,000 casualties that day, well over half were Union soldiers. But the rebels under Robert E. Lee withdrew from the battlefield, so President Lincoln claimed victory. And 5 days later, on September 22nd, 1862, with his victory in hand, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in which he warned the 10 states in rebellion that if they did not lay down their arms to the Union by the 1st of he gave them 100 days. Remember, he had to give them at least 60. He was going to declare free their slaves. Well, the rebels do not believe that Lincoln and the Union Army can make good this threat because they believe they're winning the war. So they don't come back into the Union. And on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issues the final Emancipation Proclamation, in which he declared forever free all persons held as slaves in the 10 states that were at war with the United States for their independence. In the 5 slaveholding states that accepted Abraham Lincoln as president, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply because President Lincoln had no legal authority to declare free slaves in states that were not in rebellion. Only in states that were in rebellion, in states that had to be brought back into the Union by military force. But if we recall, the Army needs help. In paragraph 6 of the Emancipation Proclamation is where President Lincoln issued the order to recruit and enlist men of African descent into all armed services of the United States. That cry for help is what begins the aggressive recruitment of the soldiers we honor. And the next room is our soldiers' room.